Hello everyone, and welcome back to FLOSS, our course on open source software and how it's changing the industry. We are now solidly in our second part, talking about the economics underlying open source software and in particular business models, economic motivation that have made open source software a sustainable phenomenon. Last time we talked about perhaps the most visible way of how open source software gets organized, which are the so-called developer foundations. This time we will be talking about another variant of open source software foundations, which I call user foundations. So unlike developer foundations, which are motivated and organized by software developing companies, product vendors, user foundations are motivated and organized by software user firms. So then again, we are talking about innovation that open source software has brought us specifically for business models, and that is the fourth major domain or area of innovation from open source. Here you can see as a recap the timeline of open source software projects that I observe. I updated it and added service and support firms, which I had previously ignored because I didn't count them as important among the business models, but I've been convinced otherwise. Recapping this year, we can distinguish the original community projects, which also stuck with a pure community organization approach, typically around a web place, website, and a software license that put into place the basics of the legal relationship between the participating entities, developers, companies, etc. Distributor firms, to remind you, are a particular type of for-profit open source software where the product is a so-called distribution, that is a well-configured set of open source software components like the Linux operating system, consisting of the Linux kernel and then 10,000 other components that make the whole product. Now, the intellectual property owned and capitalized on here by the firms is, of course, the configuration, the knowledge about what works well with what. Again, it's configuration data, test suites, etc., not the open source software itself, which obviously is free based on the open source license. Service and support firms are those companies which earn a living by servicing, for example, as a service software, or providing support services, hotline, bug fixes, etc. Developer foundations we discussed again last time are the Apache Software Foundation, Eclipse Foundation, Linux Foundation, to name a few large ones, but also smaller ones like WordPress, the WordPress Foundation, Drupal Foundation, etc. They organize software vendors and people or companies earning a living with open source software in a coherent and fair ecosystem to provide complementary products and services around the open source software developed and managed by the Developer Foundation. Related to that, not related to that is are the single vendor open source firms like distributor firms, a for-profit open source model, which, like distributor firms, we will be addressing in a few slide decks, in another few sessions. And these are also known as open core models. Companies try to actually benefit from dominating in a strong way, usually using hard intellectual property rights, from dominating a particular popular open source project, which they usually developed in the first place and open sourced as a go-to-market strategy. Again, I will address this in later sessions. So today it is user foundations like the Kuali Foundation or the GenIVI Alliance, which were started by companies using software, not by software product vendors. And these are the 6 business models I just talked about by looking at the timeline. And when you look at open source projects again, you can have projects which are based on and driven forward by users ultimately, like GNU Health. But GNU Health is project-based. There is no formal organization beyond the FSF, but it's not really a developer or user foundation. Usually the interests of the stakeholders in a particular piece of software are organized by a non-profit entity taking over the management of all things that need to be agreed on and managed, for example, joint rights into trademarks by some organization, and the Kuali Foundation will be an example we'll be looking at. So here's the definition. An open source user foundation is a non-profit organization that was created with the purpose of funding and managing, but not necessarily developing, of funding and managing the development of non-differentiating open source software, which then is made available to the general public because it's open source software. So the key here is it's usually started by software user firms like banks or universities who need software for their operations. They are not selling products based on the open source software. They just want to use the open source software. And these users join forces with each other to jointly manage, to fund, first of all, pay for, fund, and also then manage the roadmap and what's up next in terms of features, the development of the software they all want. It's non-differentiating, competitively non-differentiating software, because if it wasn't, people would be in each other's hairs all the time. So it really is just software that costs them money, but that doesn't help them in the marketplace as they might be competing with each other. So for user foundations, much like for developer foundations, the software being developed is always not what differentiates one in the marketplace, because then it would have to be each individual company developing it, but rather it is what just creates costs and where everyone is better off if it was only developed jointly. Then, of course, that software is open source software, because open source has given us a good model of how to collaborate effectively, how to do so with a clear intellectual property regimen, how to do so with clear rules of good governance, as exemplified by now a whole stream of well-working open source foundations, etc. Switching to open source makes things more predictable from a legal perspective, from a development perspective, and hence it's a preferred model over classic consortia, which are not open source, or if they are not open source. So then it's almost redundant to say that since it's open source software, it's made available to the public. So the members of such a user foundation are, first of all and foremost, perhaps the software user firms. Those who need the software, who ultimately also pay for it. They are the founding members, typically have their own band or level or type of memberships that puts them in the driver's seat, as we will see. But there is no software without successful software without some support by companies earning a living from that. So in addition to the original user firms, you may have software vendors, consulting firms, service and support firms joining the foundation in order to provide, well, additional products, additions, add-ons, plugins, services, consulting, etc. To the general communal open source software. And we'll see how that works in a bit. So here are a couple of examples of user foundations. The Kuali Foundation is about software to operate universities. And it's perhaps the longest running example and maybe also the best understood one, which is why we will take a closer look in a couple of slides. OpenMDM is an industry working group of the Eclipse Foundation, which is one particular way of organizing a user foundation. So you join the Eclipse, most of the necessary back office work, which is similar between what a user foundation needs and what a developer foundation needs. But then it's not just a regular Eclipse project, what the software being developed, but rather it is software under the guidance of an industry working group, read User Foundation. And here the example, OpenMDM, is about measure data management, test data management, I think mostly from the automotive domain, where as you're testing cars, you generate huge amounts of test data from all kinds of possible sources, then possibly incompatible with each other, etc., etc. So you simply want standards across the industry to manage those data, that data. All right, then there's Apereo. I think that's something in the e-learning space. I don't quite remember. Polarsys is also an industry working group of the Eclipse Foundation. There's a business model here for the Eclipse Foundation. Polarsys is the aerospace industry, developing better UML tooling based on the Eclipse IDE so that they can model and trace and what have you, the software being developed for them. So it is the users of the software which actually have a heavy bit of software development themselves, developing the tooling they need because they are not properly supported by what the market has to offer. In that particular case, maybe you want to hold in for a minute and wonder, why wouldn't Airbus, as an example, company, software user firm here, simply buy better UML tooling from some vendor? What do you think? Well, it's probably not obvious, but if you think a little bit, maybe it is. The reason is that the products that Airbus produces, airplanes among other things, are very long-lived. So they have time horizons where they need to maintain products and evolve them of 30, 50, sometimes even 70 years that they are looking at. I don't think there's a 70-year-old software company around, if you're discounting, say, IBM. And hence, there's an inherent mismatch between the speed of how software companies come and leave the market and what the products of these long-lived companies need. So Polarsys got, or the user companies behind Polarsys got royally upset with the vendors that supplied the UML tooling going out of business all the time. And hence they needed, they figured they need their own tooling in order to achieve a long-lived life, a long life for those tools they need in their own product development. Prometheus is a consortium of insurance companies in Germany jointly developing some of the software they need. GenIVI, I never know, I don't think there is an official spelling, is a alliance officially, consortium if you will, of automotive companies, both OEMs and suppliers, to define Linux stacks and standards that all need for more compatible, more easier to produce software, mostly in the infotainment stack, so the car center console with the radio and music and Bluetooth and what have you. OpenETCS is the OpenETCS European train control or electronic train control system. So this is software that runs in locomotives, making sure that they stop properly if danger is ahead and things like that. And that was also recently turned into an open source initiative and an open source foundation. Ozera is the successor to the original MUMPS, I believe, the US Veterans Affairs Health Care software, and it's a long record. It's been around for a long time, gone through many instantiation, but now it's open source software. And the final example is one that I helped found myself, which is the OpenKonsequenz Consortium or eingetragener Verein, eventually in Germany, which is about energy providers developing jointly or managing, paying for and managing the development of the software they need for the smart grid. Next to Kuali, that is another example we will be looking at in more detail. So I gave you a broad range of examples here to show it could really be any industry, even though perhaps you're thinking that all sounds pretty technical. So my guess is that at this stage, where user foundations are still a new concept, that at this stage it's more technology affine companies who are willing to undertake this, and it will be a bit perhaps until this collaboration and funding model will reach whatever marketing agencies or so. So here's the motivation, the overarching abstract motivation for why have a user foundation. The purpose is to establish a software ecosystem in which vendors and suppliers can provide products and services on an equal playing field. So it's not about having the software for free. Rarely anything comes for free, and if it does, it comes with additional hidden pitfalls, of course. So no, it's about setting up an equal playing field. So we need to look at that. First of all, we need to understand the original challenge giving rise to user foundations. What user foundations want to achieve is to move away from the dependency on a single vendor to a situation where the software they are using can be supported and developed further by multiple vendors. That is mostly only possible if that software they are using is open source software and not the exclusive intellectual property of one particular vendor. Hence, in order to go from a single vendor who services you to multiple vendors which service you and the same software you are using, you need to make that software open source, because otherwise these additional vendors wouldn't be allowed to work with it or would be significantly challenged to do anything with it if they wouldn't have, say, access to the source code. So what's wrong then with the original situation, you may ask? What's wrong with the so-called vendor lock-in, or the lock-in into a single vendor? Well, it comes with a high total cost of ownership. Most notably, or traditionally, total cost of ownership means the part of the TCO is the license fees you pay. So you pay for an initial license fee, often still with classic proprietary closed source software, and then you pay your annual maintenance fee as discussed before. And if you are locked in to that particular vendor and switching to some alternative is really costly, well, then that vendor can keep raising their prices on you until they are really, really close to your switching cost to someone else. They'll try to maximize their profits. That's their obligation or their goal towards their shareholders. And so they will simply try to squeeze you. But it's not just the basic license fees. There's also potentially high customization costs. Rarely does a software work out of the box. It needs to be customized for one's need. In an enterprise context, as you take a commercial off-the-shelf software, it will take time for you to implement it, to configure it. That's the easier part. More often, to develop additional components that tie in that software into your environment, to make it connect to other software you're already running, to add some function or feature that you really, really need in order because you want to believe you can compete better with it in the marketplace. So for that, you need some consulting company. And unless it's SAP or one really large vendor, there is not a lot of choice of companies to provide those implementation or customization services. It's usually the original company only who sold you the initial license. Now, of course, these guys are experts on the software, so they're a good choice. But if they are successful, there's a large, long line of other companies using the software, paying the licenses, and also needing their customizations. So you line up, and maybe 2 years later, it's your turn, and you'll get your new feature. except that 2 years later means you missed your own window of opportunity why you needed that to put to use that feature that you needed. So the customization cost is high because you're locked in to that one particular vendor, and then you may not even get it quickly. So there's no or slow realization of the customizations you need to be successful in your marketplace. As a consequence, you miss windows of opportunities, get your product or your service out late, etc. You can't even change to changing market requirements if it's not on the roadmap of your vendor itself. So basically, the control over your future is taken away from you because of that dependency that is so hard to manage. Finally, it's a closed source vendor. What do you do if they go out of business? This is very real, as discussed with the aerospace guys. Their tool vendors, software tool vendors, did go out of business, which is why they started Polaris. Applies to anyone else too. What happens if your vendor goes out of business? You go buy new software. The switching costs can be very high, and if the software breaks down while you haven't switched yet, well, you do have a problem. So there are lots of reasons that speak against this classic closed source software buy, but of course they also have downsides. I'll look to that in a few seconds to switch away from that to open source. So the goal here is to set up again this ecosystem of support services, implementation services, additional software. This ecosystem based on community open source software. And so we get two layers. There is the community open source software platform, potentially, that is being developed, and the development of which is being managed by the user foundation. This is truly community, meaning the user foundation, and then as open source for the whole world. It's truly community open source. That's very unlikely that a user foundation decides to go with a dual license. They just want one license, and it depends on the strategy of the user foundation, whether that's a permissive or a reciprocal license. Both are possible with different effects. Now, this is the base layer or the bottom layer, and the top layer is the provision of what you have to pay for services, implementation, consulting, customization services, as well as hotline and support services, meaning commercial products owned by a particular vendor in this ecosystem, built on the platform, built on the community open source software. So the community open source provides the platform on top of which different companies can now compete for business with the software user companies. So if you will, yes, software users are paying twice. They first pay, but they pay jointly and thereby much less. They first pay for the development of the community open source. And then later, but this is community open source, that's something you can grab from the web. If you have really capable guys, you can operate it in your data centers, perhaps. But more likely, you will want to then buy a customized version or a specifically supported version from a vendor. So yes, you're paying for a second time to a vendor who then provides all the professional things that you are expecting of closed source software and provides that to you, assuming that you're willing to pay for it. So that creates the market for products and services on top of the community open source platform. It really looks like, say, the community open source platform would be WordPress, and then commercial products would be plugins and themes. The structural setup is similar, except now that here the platform, the community open source software, is developed by the users themselves and not by the original creators of the software like WordPress. So you get these two layers. Software users are paying twice, but each time they pay much less than if they were to pay for it with a closed source software solution. And so that's why in total it creates a lower total cost of ownership. So what this requires then is obviously software companies who are willing to provide this second layer of services. If there's a market, there may well be those companies. But again, that market needs to be fair. So it needs to be transparent in the sense of that a company that wants to provide services here, additional software and services, etc., needs to feel good about its investment, which means that the structural setup, the governance of the user foundation needs to be transparent with respect to core issues like intellectual property and trademarks. And only if it appears to be fair will a vendor typically enter such an ecosystem. They may be less attracted to it in the first place because they are now competing with others. And it's harder, much harder to build up a sustainable advantage over your competitors, to sell easier, have a higher margin. And so it maybe is not as attractive a market. But if there is that market, as opposed to there is nothing else where they could work and earn the margins they want to, then maybe actually it is, again, an attractive market. So in order for that ecosystem to be fair, the economic setup and incentives need to be such that those vendors need to be able to earn a decent living. They are not likely to earn outsized returns like closed source vendors, say like Microsoft did, but they should still be able to earn a decent living. And really the customers are companies, they are professionals, they understand that their suppliers of software and services need to live and hence are willing to pay, usually budget, unlike private persons, budget for paying for software. From the user perspective, it's much harder to get logged in. And if you're unhappy with a particular service provider, then because their work is based on open source software and others can come into this market with a very low barrier to entry, no intellectual property to acquire, because they can come in with a very low barrier to entry, well, it means that there is competition and the users who are unhappy with one provider may be able to switch to another. So here again now, let's take a look at these two layers. The base layer is the community open source layer, and it needs to be developed in such a way that the user foundation, by way of working groups or what have you, manages the roadmap of the software, sets the high-level features and directions for that. The foundation itself may actually own the software, or it may just be regulated by a license, doesn't matter, but it usually wants to do IP cleanliness, as the Eclipse Foundation calls it, wants to check up on IT being clean and license compliant, etc. Now, the user foundation also should contain a working group or dedicated people who manage the actual development in the sense of quality assurance, tracking, etc. These could be individual people particularly engaged from the user foundations. It could simply be outsourced to some consulting company which is strong in project management and quality assurance. It just should be set up in such a way that this project management company, if it's an external company, doesn't have a conflict of interest. So they should actually not be developers of the software at the same time. That's the third role here, SD, the software developer, software development company, who actually do the development of the software. They do so instructed and paid for often by the user foundation, which again sets the roadmap, and they get managed and their work gets tested and quality assured by the PM project managers here. Now, on this level, the user foundation typically puts out tenders, requests quotes, chooses a software development company, say, to develop a new feature or some new component for the platform. And what we see today is indeed that software development companies will not develop new features if they are not paid for it. My hope actually is that over time, if these ecosystems are attractive, that over time the software developers by themselves will start contributing without being paid, because it positions them on the second layer that we'll talk about in a few minutes. Because on that second layer, then they are better positioned to sell their services. You see, here the user foundation pays software developers or manages the roadmap. But on the next higher level, where you ideally have multiple software vendors and support and services providers competing for a specific user company's business, on that layer, you need to sell, and you are, as a software vendor or service provider, and you're competing potentially with many others, depending on how lucrative the market is. And to compete efficiently, you need to show that you're actually capable of doing good work around the software. For example, if one user company really wants one particular feature that nobody else in the user foundation wants, they may have to pay for it individually. And so then they will be looking for a software vendor who is skilled in the community open source software, so that there's a high likelihood of success of that implementation project, of that highly specific feature that the user wants. So then on the second layer, now it is individual companies, not a foundation, individual companies dealing with each other. One user company, as an example, potentially acquiring plugins or proprietary licensed software. They don't have to, but maybe they do for some special additional software, where they pay a classic software vendor who develop these add-ons on top of the community platform. And they may also pay a services company for support services, implementation services to make the community open source software, or maybe a commercial product built on the community open source software, work for them well in their data center. So on the second layer, you have more money flowing to the software companies, be they vendors or services firms. And as a whole, depending on the circumstances, hopefully makes for an attractive market. So let's look at some examples. There's the Prometheus Foundation, which is a German dominated consortium of insurance companies. I think the project's pretty slow now. This was one of the early ones. I'm not sure you could say it failed, but it certainly spent time and effort and money, of course, to develop jointly software for back office agents of insurance companies. The GenIVI Alliance is well alive and kicking, initially started by BMW, now comprising several other major OEMs and lots of Tier 1, Tier 2 suppliers. Their purpose and goal is to create a common Linux-based platform for car infotainment. Again, the center console of your car. And it was created because BMW was so frustrated over the complexity of managing the software supply chain that led to the final release that was usually put into the center console, the infotainment section of BMW. And BMW went about it pretty professional. GenIVI has actually been around for 8-9 years now and has a professional alliance manager, a company who manages it. But it's not so much, as far as I know, really open source code that's being developed here, but rather open specifications that then companies, suppliers conform to. Okay, OpenETCS, the European train control system, is a standard which makes locomotives safe, gets them to brake properly. And this is a highly complex hardware-software co-design topic with lots of software these days. And after lots of proprietary and, despite a standard, incompatible ECTS solutions, Deutsche Bahn went ahead, put out a tender for an open source, open ETCS solution, and actually got companies to submit that their software be open sourced and be put into Deutsche Bahn locomotives, ICE locomotives and others, and be used there. So the pressure on the suppliers, the classic software vendors here, led to several of them actually eventually to offer to open source their software. So contrary to popular belief, apparently the software itself is not that much of a crown jewel. Maybe it was pretty bad shape, but who knows. But the actual value was in the associated labor that then, I think in this case, Bombardier won the tender, the request for quotes. Bombardier was paid in order to develop it further and get it into proper shape for open sourcing and later contribution by other companies. Oh no, so it wasn't Bombardier, it was Alstom here. So some hardcore users, maybe the guy who heads or gal who heads a data center, may not be convinced yet, because there are obvious downsides to getting that active, as you have to be if you participate in a user foundation. Many data centers simply will say, I just want to buy license the software I want to use. I definitely don't want to be bothered with its design and implementation and take on that risk and put money in. We are not into capital investment, into software development. We just want to buy a license fee and be happy. Well, except that you are not very happy if all these downsides of vendor lock-in kick in that I mentioned before. So here's a comparative evaluation, if you will, of going with a single closed source vendor versus going with a user foundation with respect to some component in your data center. The costs in the single vendor case or in the closed source case are a high license and maintenance fees and the danger of getting blackmailed there, the potentially high customization fees, and the services fees. The risks are that the company dies, and with it the product, or just the product dies, and because the company doesn't want to develop it further. Also, a well-satiated company will stop innovating. If there's little competition, if some closed source company has cornered the market, why would they keep investing in innovation? Well, they would do only the minimal amount to keep people somewhat happy and to fend off anyone else. Innovation doesn't help profits necessarily. Basically, there's the risk that costs escalates. Now compare that with the user foundation model. The costs in total, if it actually works, the costs in total are much lower. Yes, if on that second layer, as you are acquiring products and services from vendors, you may actually be paying some license and maintenance fee. You can also try to use the community software directly, but maybe you don't want to, or you want some professional provider. You also have the customization and services fee. After all, it's just software. It needs to be put into a practical use. But the actual price tag here is much lower than with a single vendor model because you can switch. You have alternatives. That was the whole purpose of the user foundation, to create an equal level playing field where there would be multiple vendors rather than just one. And as soon as you have multiple vendors, you have competition. As soon as you have competition, you have prices being driven to a reasonable level and no blackmailing of you. Now, user foundations, while the basic costs can be much cheaper, come with additional costs, which are the management attention you need to spend on the open source foundation, and the development costs you pay as you contribute to the overall expenses for developing the software, etc. So that is risky. The project may fail, which is why people choose open source foundations, because open source collaboration is somewhat well defined and increasingly software developers know how to do it. In general, I think management needs to be so annoyed about its closed source situation that it decides we can't keep going like this and wants to get active themselves. An example of from an economic perspective is if you find yourself sending your people to user group meetings where they're basically doing the job of the product manager of that vendor, then maybe it's time to take matters into your own hands. So the benefits of the user foundations are that they don't have these risks and the high costs of single vendor models, but they do come with their own risks. So beware of what you're getting into. So summarizing that, user foundations are typically created, that's my observation, when the frustration over suppliers, the Innovationsstau, so the stop of innovation, the high costs, etc., outweigh the perceived additional hassles of creating that foundation. But if you're already so active in user groups that you're already expanding, that you are already expanding those resources, those FTEs, then maybe a foundation is the way to go. So I already mentioned the advantage over traditional consortia is that open source consortia or foundations give you an established framework, legally speaking, and from a developer collaboration perspective. Basically, you have lower risk, you're more likely to get usable software, and you're going to get there faster at lower cost, etc. So higher likelihood of success if you do it all the open source way. Now again, I will look at in detail at a few more examples. So there are what I would now call, even though they are not that old, classic standalone user foundations like Kuali, Apereo, Prometheus. There are the industry working groups where the companies decided we don't need to create another corporation. We'll just go with an established one like the Eclipse Foundation. Though OpenKonsequenz just decided to leave the Eclipse Foundation. Some are strongly vendor-driven, even though they are user foundations. Some foundations actually don't accept companies, only natural people as the users. There are all kinds of variants. I will now turn to the most successful example of them, I think, which is the Kuali Foundation for software to manage the university's business. So that is enrollment of students, course management, grade management, but also marketing of the university, financials, fundraising, payroll, things like that. Classic enterprise resource planning, ERP, business type of software that's needed by the universities. And because perhaps they are not as lucrative a market as, say, oil and gas is for SAP, they felt they were not as well served. And maybe the specifics of universities were just so different from what oil and gas or banking and insurance or what have you needed, that they decided to develop the software they need open source style themselves. So the original motivation, if you read the literature, was high costs of licenses from closed source vendors, that the software they paid so much for then didn't even fit their needs very well, so lacking performance didn't fit needs. And they couldn't really influence where the software was headed. They really wanted to influence the roadmap, but they could not. So they chose to establish the Kuali Foundation, an open source user foundation, to save the day. It started modestly. It started with some grant and has been growing ever since with more American universities. So this is America-based, US-based, joining the fray. So here's the more detailed timeline. Actually, it started in 2002 at Indiana University. Who decided to develop a financial system. A couple of years later, received a grant for further development, then got other partners on board, created a foundation because now these other partners wanted clear rules that everyone would play by, started developing more components, received more grants, developed more infrastructure, etc., etc. And it's interesting in that it's actually not the universities who pay out of their own pockets. They decided to acquire grants. And so I don't know whether this will always be the case like this. Say in the other case of the OpenKonsequenz Foundation that I'll also be talking about, it's actually out of the budget of the involved energy providers. So when you look at something like the Kuali Foundation, from an organizational perspective, you recognize a blueprint similar to the one of the developer foundations that we already looked at. So you need to clarify the organizational setup. You certainly want to have a vision and mission. So what's your purpose? How do you manage? You will need to clarify how to manage intellectual property, set up all the governance, the board, who can be a member, what membership levels are there, and last but not least, how to govern development and how to finance all that. So in the case of the Kuali Foundation, it's because it's focusing on the American market of US universities. It's actually a US-based 501c3 for the public benefit, non-profit foundation. The purpose is, well, to develop administrative software for higher education being colleges and universities, while keeping costs low and sharing knowledge and best practices effectively. They want to develop the software collaboratively and potentially internationally, though they are pretty clearly US focused for now. Obviously, it all needs to be sustainable. Kuali has evolved from the original Kuali Foundation, which provides and develops the community open source software, which is just software that you download from the web, has evolved to create a commercial subsidiary. So Kuali Foundation has created Kuali Co., a commercial company which takes the software, the very software that everyone else can also take, and provides them as a service through the web. That is a more recent development and an interesting one, because it puts somewhat into question that if there's one such strong party in the marketplace, is there actual room for other competing parties? And we will look at that as well. So like every good organization, it's got core values defined in the bylaws of the organization, and they are as to be expected, that the software is open, that it has well-working communities. Here they are functionally driven, meaning by user needs rather than say, hey, let's have great infrastructure that doesn't do anything useful. It's open development, but and open source based on a community. So you can certainly develop openly, but it's not a community. The priorities are developed defined by the members of the Kuali Foundation. And, well, as always, value diversity. They chose the Affero GNU public license, a viral or a reciprocal license. So they argue that, or they believe that they wouldn't want anyone on that second layer to provide anything else really but services, or at least make it really hard to develop proprietary software as additional products to be provided by the market based on the community open source software of Kuali. So they really enforce that by using the strongest reciprocal license. I think that this probably hurts the interest of software companies. It makes the market much less attractive because there's just no way now that you can build up intellectual property in the form of software around the community open source software that is your property. They had to introduce an exception to or an explanation to some of the technical terms, in particular what's formerly been called distribution means. In the AGPL it's called conveyance, meaning users of the software. So students who use the software through the web do not experience conveyance. They do not receive a binary of the software in the eyes of the Kuali Foundation, and hence do not have a right to request the source code. What that means is that the university can take the software, put it into place in the data center, modify it, and because the use of the software through students does not constitute conveyance, it doesn't have to lay open upon request by students any potential modification they've made. As long as they don't commercially provide the software now, as long as they don't provide a binary or something to paying customers or the like. Now nobody will ever get to see any modifications they made. Certainly it's important that students maybe don't get to look at grading algorithms. I don't know, whatever might have been added. At least that's what the universities believe. Maybe it would be a good thing, who knows. So I'm curious really whether the creation of a commercial subsidiary of a non-profit foundation, yes, that's possible, called Kuali Co. here, will introduce a conflict of interest. And Kuali Co. will actually say, yep, the core software will always be free, but we are developing automation code, multi-tenant code that will not be made publicly available. Hence, Kuali Co. is establishing a positional advantage by way of hardcore IP that only they have when compared with other potential competitors who might use the same community open source software to provide products and services to universities. Looking at the governance, the Kuali Foundation has all kinds of members, most notably, of course, the universities as the original software users, but also plenty commercial or some commercial affiliates. There were 11 commercial affiliates in 2013 before there was Kuali Co. And after Kuali Co. was introduced, there were only 5 commercial affiliates. So maybe that does suggest that having a well-positioned or uniquely positioned company like Kuali Co. actually hurts the commercial ecosystem. But maybe on the other hand, that is one of the questions, maybe on the other hand, the market size, if you will, is so small that the final solution always, and also in similar situations, will be that there's a main nonprofit and then one subsidiary that's a commercial company. You don't really want that because you want competition to drive innovation forward and keep quality up, but it perhaps depends. That's one of the open questions. It perhaps depends on the size of the market. All right, so board members in the Kuali Foundation mostly get appointed, some get elected. Projects, meaning projects that develop, well, are projects or perhaps develop certain components. They need a charter, they are typically cross-linked, there is some underlying platform that they need to tap into, but otherwise they're considered pretty independent. It uses the common pattern of projects having a board, a project management committee similar to developer foundations, and then you have the basic committer and contributor roles. Then software development, again, is project-centric, function-focused, and is based on a platform. So Kuali made it to a good situation where there is a hopefully well-working function, a platform that supports the various business functions, large-scale business functions, like payroll or cost management of a university. Now, the foundation, of course, does not develop the software itself. It's only a legal construct to create that level and equal playing field. Usually, development is contracted out, and these projects are then often acquiring the necessary funds from the members. So the financing here only relates to the operations of the foundation, not to any particular project. That's membership dues. It pays for back office, incorporation, probably a tax accountant, etc. As you can see, the Kuali Foundation has had a 2016, I think, had a staff of 4 people. Obviously, that's not major. While Kuali Co, the commercial service provision, actually had a staff of 31, and they were obviously making money off the Kuali software. So the Kuali Foundation is a US nonprofit for higher education, universities. also allowing for commercial partners to create all software necessary to run higher education institutions. It was motivated very classically by lack of performance and high price of existing business solutions that were just not right for the universities trying to use them. And it takes a community approach, community open source approach to developing the software that all the members need. All right, so maybe I'll be a bit more speedy now. I have a second example which is dear to my heart because I helped found it together with one Peter Hurt of Then Energy, now Mein Donau Netz GmbH. Please take a look at the guest speaker playlist on our YouTube channel where you can see Mr. Hurt go over the details of the history of the OpenKonsequenz user foundation for energy distribution managers. So the motivation here is similar, the one to be expected. The old closed source model was not working well. There were strong dependencies on one particular supplier with high cost and sluggish responses because they could. They had everyone, or they have most people, locked in. And hence there was little ability, despite extensive user groups, little ability to influence the direction of the software where it was going. Changing things to make it work better for one specific energy provider was also not easily possible and high risk because it's all closed source. And then on top of that frustration, new software challenges happen. Specifically in Germany, it's the smart grid, long-term Energiewende, energy development, infrastructure support in Germany, where, for example, now lots of houses feed back energy from the solar panels on the roofs, feed back energy into the energy distribution network. And for that, software needs to be written so that there's a quid pro quo, or basically the now energy providers, the homes, get properly compensated for the energy they put into the system. So the original motivation of OpenKonsequenz was actually, oh my, what to do about that poor old software, but then quickly changed to, oh my, what to do about the new upcoming software challenges, and it was decided to address these new challenges in the form of a user foundation. Here's a timeline, but please take a look at the video recording with Mr. Hirt. Here's a basic timeline of 7 years now. First initial contact in 2010, all the way feasibility studies, initial specification, an Eclipse industry working group, but this year its own foundation now. More specifications, more development being paid for by the energy distribution network managers, or the energy providers here. Okay, so the organizational setup. First, they went with the industry with the Eclipse Foundation by joining them for an industry working group. Eventually, the $20,000 per year per company per member were too much, and they are now working towards that German e.V. or Genossenschaft. They have various steering committees, the general one, but then also project planning, architecture, and quality committee, which look over the different aspects of that are relevant about the software they need. Well, the purpose, very clear now, is to develop open source software for the energy sector and thereby also motivate and drive innovation forward. The chosen license, which, if you will, is the IP philosophy underlying it, is the Eclipse public license. And that is different from the Kuali Foundation. The EPL requires that you, as you distribute or convey some piece of software, that you also provide the source code as it relates to the core of the software, as defined by the original files that you may have changed. But if you provide plugins or build on top of it, the copyleft doesn't grip, doesn't apply, This is called a weak copyleft. And so it's possible for companies here to build proprietary extensions that they can then possibly sell into this marketplace of energy providers. Well, the steering committee members are the founding driver members. This is the name for the user companies, the energy distribution network providers here who instigated all of this. There are different types of memberships, so they do want companies on board, the service providers, implementers, etc. And they even allow for guest members. For example, FAU, my university, is a guest member as we are engaged with them in various projects. So the driver members, again, are the user companies, Main-Donau-Netz, Netring, Westnetz, etc., and increasingly more. I think there are 7 or 8 now. Service providers would be companies like IBM, BTC, or SAG, and guest members is various universities, office, etc. Projects are open for everyone within the Eclipse governance model, which will probably be kept. So you can contribute if you like to, but you of course need to meet their quality criteria, and as you learned in class, if you want to contribute, announce it in advance and discuss what it is that you're doing so that you don't surprise anyone and are not surprised yourself that nobody cares or ignores your potential contribution. Well, it's a foundation, it's got its processes. Planning leads to module specifications, then financing is secured from the members. They put out requests for quotes, usually the lowest adequate, always the lowest adequate bidder wins. There are various roles implied, etc. There's a final quality assurance process and so forth. The foundation itself also, again, is small. There are annual membership dues planned, and it will pay for the minimal staff needed to operate the foundation, but not to pay for software development. That's always an extra separate step. So far, but in the future not any longer, the operations are handled by the Eclipse Foundation. So summarizing, the OpenKonsequenz User Consortium or Foundation is an industry working group for now of the Eclipse Foundation, which develops open source software for the energy industry, the energy sector. The original motivation was a dissatisfaction with the closed source software available to them, but they now sponsor new development through the members, and it is performed by consulting services implementation firms. I mentioned this already. If I think about this model, which is still fairly new, what could be stumbling blocks? And I imagine that if the market size is too small, then it may be hard. But on the other hand, if the market size is too small, you won't even get a closed source vendor to be interested in you. But of course, if a closed source vendor provides its products and services, then they will increase the price. So maybe there is a dead zone where it's not enough for user foundations, but good enough for small fry software vendors. Yeah. So as these user foundations are being built, they need to watch out that they don't fall into the trap of the old vendor lock-in, which in this case wouldn't necessarily be tied to software so much, but maybe to knowledge lock-in, that there really quickly is only one vendor who knows how to handle things, and so becomes the one and only go-to partner, and then that's also some form of lock-in. All right, so today we talked about user foundations, gave a definition as a non-profit organization managing the development, not necessarily developing themselves, of community open source software for the benefit of the public, but actually mostly intended for the members or a particular industry sector. We looked at the economics and the governance of it and looked at 2 particular examples, the Kuali Foundation for university software and the OpenKonsequenz soon-to-be foundation for energy distribution networks. All right, that's it from me. Thank you very much for your time, and I will see you next time.